everyone! Ever pondered how we distinguish between the good and the bad? What is right and wrong? Well, in today's discussion, we will explore these questions and we will learn to compare and contrast various ethical systems in terms of how good and right is defined. We will also be delving into teleological theories and utilitarianism. Starting off with module number 1. Module 1 will help you create an understanding of the different types of ethical systems, and this will explain the fundamental requirements in order to compare and contrast these various ethical systems. In order to compare and contrast ethical theories, we must first determine the 3 fundamental elements that must be contained in an ethical theory. First, a complete theory must provide a definition of good and also the bad. Second, it must provide a definition of what is right in terms of the good. And lastly, it must provide a statement of the moral principle in clear and certain terms. Remember, these are bare minimum requirements of an ethical theory. Without these elements, the theory will be incomplete. In normative ethics, a basic distinction is drawn between a statement of value and statement of obligation. Statement of value is in the form of an evaluative statement, and it deals with the moral philosopher's estimate of the worth or value of an act, object, person, and event. An example of this statement is studying is good and being kind is correct. Statement of obligation, on the other hand, is in the form of either a prescriptive statement or proscriptive statement, and it deals with what you ought to do. These statements pertain to your duty and obligation. A prescriptive statement presents what you must do, while a prescriptive statement states what you must not do. An example of a statement of obligation is the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are made up of prescriptive statements like thou shalt not steal, you shall not bear false witness, and you shall not commit adultery. These commandments are formal support to the religious customs and traditions of a group of people in which they would know what they should not do. Notice that people who share a form of life or language game are likely to judge or evaluate the worth and value of an act the same way. Thus, interacting with people who accept the same code of morality strengthens the intersubjective consensus. Let us now move on in determining what is good. Intrinsic good and instrumental good are used by moral philosophers when dealing with the moral concept of good. Think of intrinsic good as the necessary good. Intrinsic good is good in itself, while instrumental good is something useful and meaningful because it leads to something more valuable. For instance, Aristotle believes that happiness is the only intrinsic good. According to him, happiness then is something final and self-sufficient and is the end of action. Happiness is summum bonum, which means it is the greatest good of all human life. Basically, Aristotle believes that happiness is the greatest of all time. Another example, if you play Super Mario and you play it because it is fun and not for other points, then the intrinsic good in this example is that you play it by the mere feeling of fun and not for other rewards. But if you are playing hard to attain other rewards, then that is where instrumental good comes in. Instrumental good leads us to something more fulfilling. Note that there is no consensus among the philosophers on what is to be considered intrinsic good or instrumental good. Examples of intrinsic good and instrumental good can sometimes be interchanged depending on the orientation of the philosopher. There are even philosophers like John Dewey who deny the concept of intrinsic good and would claim that all goods are instrumental goods. For him, intrinsic good are basically instrumental good because it will lead to something more valuable such as growth. Furthermore, 2 types of ethical systems can be drawn from intrinsic good: monist and pluralist. The monist would argue that there is only one thing that is intrinsically good. One good example of this would be hedonism, which believes that bodily pleasure is the highest good and is the only intrinsic good. Jeremy Bentham, a moral philosopher, believed that only pleasure is intrinsically good. He emphasized his hedonistic calculus, intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent of pleasure, which will be further discussed in Module 2. Hedonistic calculus measures the quantitative worth or value of pleasures, and he believed that the quality of pleasure is unimportant because there is only one kind of pleasure. Furthermore, Epicurus and J.S. Mill believed that there is a higher form of pleasure than what Bentham emphasized. Hence, they attempted to highlight the quality of pleasure in terms of physical, intellectual, and spiritual. For Mill, intellectual pleasure is the only intrinsic good, and the quantity of bodily pleasure is unimportant. He says, "I would rather be a man dissatisfied than a pig satisfied," making an emphasis that quantity is unimportant and quality matters the most. Proceeding to the second ethical system from intrinsic good, pluralist. If the monist would argue that there is only one intrinsic good, a pluralist, on the other hand, from the word plural, believes that there is more than one intrinsic good. This contradicts hedonistic positions. Thus, pluralists are non-hedonists because they believe that pleasure is not the only intrinsic good. In order to make up the good, Plato presented his belief of a mixed life, which is a balance of proportion, beauty, intelligence, wisdom, science, pure pleasure of the soul, and etc. W.D. Ross believes that virtuous disposition, knowledge, pleasure, and a just proportion of pleasure to the virtues are the only four things that are intrinsically good. Now that we have determined what is good, let us now determine what is right. Moral philosophers are divided into two when asked the question of moral obligation, which is what you ought to do. Either they are deontologists or teleologists. A deontologist judges the rightness of an act by the act alone. For them, consequences are unimportant and do not play a role in determining what is right. An example of this is the Ten Commandments, in which the acts that are prohibited are stated in clear and simple terms. There are no specific rules or instructions because as long as you obey these commandments, your actions are right. Thus, the consequences of the act are not important. The nature of the act itself determines whether it is right or not. A teleologist, on the other hand, judges and evaluates the rightness of the act in terms of consequences. The act must maximize the intrinsic good. For instance, if the intrinsic good is happiness, then an act that maximizes happiness is a right action and wrong if it doesn't. For example, you are playing a game with your friends wherein you must work as a team to defeat the enemy, but each player has limited health. You have the ability to heal your teammates, but you can only save one teammate at a time per round. You have one teammate that is now low on health, but is not really good at playing the game. And your other teammate has more health, but knows how to play the game and has a higher chance to make your whole team win in the end. With your healing ability, who will you save? The teleological approach would be healing the highly skilled teammate because that will probably have the best outcome, which is maximizing the chance of winning for your team. However, the deontological approach focuses on what is morally right, which is to heal the one with the lowest health. This does not consider any other consequences or factors. The teleologist is divided on the issue of the beneficiary of the right actions that maximizes the intrinsic good, namely egoism and utilitarianism. In egoism, the one who benefits from the act is the moral agent himself, and any action that maximizes the good for him or her is right. As stated by Plato's version of egoism, each person ought to do what will further his self-interest. From the word ego, we can say that the moral principle is self-directed. Under egoism, there is a version of reciprocity called enlightened egoism, which means that you ought to do an act for a person because you expect them to do the same to you. This means that helping other people is calculated to promote one's self-interest. If an egoist asks the question, what actions will maximize the greatest good for me? A utilitarian, on the other hand, asks the question, what will maximize the good for the greatest number? Thus, in utilitarianism, the moral principle is other-directed. There are also different types of utilitarianism. If an action benefits only a group of people while negatively impacting others, it is called limited utilitarianism. Groups that support these ethical systems include various interest groups in our society, such as NGOs, religious groups, and political parties. But if the action aims to maximize the good to all humankind without discrimination, it is called universal utilitarianism. This is known to be the purest form of utilitarianism. In universal utilitarianism, everyone is to count for one and no one for more than one.
Moving on to Module 2 titled Teleological Theories. This chapter is divided into 4 sections. First, quantitative and qualitative hedonism. Second, the beneficiary of good. Third, the principle of utility. And lastly, hedonistic calculus. First, let's learn about teleological theory. It says here that teleological ethics determines the rightness or wrongness of an action based on its consequences, rather than the nature of the act itself. That means that if we did an action that is questionable today, but in the future it turned out to have good results, then that act was right. This approach contrasts with deontological ethics, which holds that some acts are inherently right or wrong, regardless of their outcomes. So let's head on to the 2 types of hedonism. But first, what is hedonism? It is a key teleological view. Hedonism considers pleasure as the ultimate good and the primary goal of human life. Hedonists believe that there is only one intrinsic good, which is pleasure. But there is a basic disagreement among teleologists which concerns the nature of the intrinsic good that is to be maximized or promoted, and that is where we are divided. You can see the first one, which is quantitative hedonism, and the second one, which is qualitative hedonism. Quantitative hedonists like Jeremy Bentham, defines good as bodily pleasure, while qualitative hedonists like J.S. Mill defines good as intellectual pleasure. Regardless, they believe that there is only one intrinsic good, which is pleasure. Teleological ethics, an important consideration is who benefits from the good produced by actions. Different theories vary their answers. First is egoism. The beneficiary is the moral agent themselves, and the maxim they live by, do the act which promotes the greatest good for oneself. And their only moral concern is what actions will maximize my own goods or enhance my own self-interest. So, in other words, they only live for themselves. They only think of themselves instead of other people. Fortunately, most teleologists will not demand that the beneficiary of the act is to be themselves alone. And this is where utilitarianism comes in. A utilitarian will argue that we have to maximize the good for the greatest number. The good should benefit the greatest number of people affected by the action without prioritizing anyone's own good. Third one are the Cyrenaics. So they're kind of similar to egoistic hedonism. They emphasize immediate bodily pleasure. Their motto is drink and be merry, for tomorrow we may die. So they do not think of the future, because future pleasure has no bearing on the present. They believe that you are to enjoy to maximize the pleasure of the moment. And this is where Epicureanism comes in. The Epicureans do not believe, or they oppose the mindset of the Cyrenaics. They believe that we need to focus on the long-term tranquility and freedom from pain. We need to seek pleasure in a state of lasting peace and mental enjoyment. We should seek after absence of pain in the mind and the body. They believe that the highest pleasure sought is the absence of pain. Jeremy Bentham is a modern proponent of utilitarianism, where pleasure and pain sets the limits of moral values in his system. Historically, Bentham builds on David Hume's argument that utility is a foundation of ethics, creating a moral philosophy centered on maximizing happiness and minimizing pain. So first, what is utility? So let's read. Measure of the potential of an action or an object to produce happiness or to prevent the occurrence of pain. So in other words, it is the capacity of an action or object to produce happiness or to prevent pain. The intended beneficiary of utility may be the individual or the community, but we cannot talk of the interests of the community without considering the interests of the individuals, because what are communities made of? They are made of individuals. So by concerning the community, you need to concern the individuals that live in that community. So there can be no better statement for democratization of pleasure and avoidance of pain than this. It ensures that everybody is taken into consideration every time a moral choice is made or a moral act is done. So while believing this philosophy, he also stated something that defends egoism, which is kind of contradictory. So he said that human nature will always pursue what will benefit his own greatest happiness without considering the effects of it on other people. So this is a very awkward point in his theory, because we know that someone that is motivated by self-interest cannot be counted on to pursue the interest of the whole or the community. But oftentimes in real life, personal interests must be sacrificed for the interests of the whole. So as stated in the principle of utility, we should follow the actions that will lead to the greatest pleasure and the avoidance of pain. So to achieve this, Bentham created hedonistic calculus. So what is it? It is a method for weighing the pleasure and pain consequences of an action to determine the best moral choice. So, Bentham proposed the following criteria for evaluating the consequences. So, there are 7 things that we should consider. First is the intensity. How strong is the pleasure or pain? Second, duration. How long will it last? Third, certainty. How likely is it to occur? Fourth is propinquity. How soon will it occur? Fifth, fecundity. Will this lead to more pleasure or will this lead to more pain? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sixth, purity. Is the pleasure free from pain or is the pain free from pleasure? And lastly, extent. How many people will be affected? Lastly, according to Bentham, an act is morally right if it maximizes total pleasure for the community, aiming at the greatest happiness for the greatest number without prioritizing one's own happiness over that of others. Your happiness doesn't have any priority over any other members of the community. So this is called limited utilitarianism.
Utilitarianism is the most influential moral philosophy in the last 2 centuries, and it is a form of teleological ethics that assesses actions based on their outcomes. It can be summed up in a few words: the greatest good for the greatest number. These words encapsulate what utilitarianism is, since it is a consequentialist ethical theory that judges the morality of actions based on their abilities to maximize happiness or the well-being of the greatest number of people. Let us acknowledge Jeremy Bentham, who was the acknowledged founder of utilitarianism. He originally took over the principle of utility from David Hume. His saying, "I felt as if the scales had fallen from my eyes. I then, for the first time, learned to call the cause of the people the cause of virtue." This saying reflects a pivotal moment in his intellectual development and his shift towards a moral philosophy centered on utilitarianism and social reform. In this metaphor, the scales symbolize a form of blindness or misunderstanding that Bentham believed he had overcome. allowing him to see clearly that the welfare and happiness of the people, or the cause of the people, were fundamentally aligned with the virtue of moral goodness. This saying also pushed Bentham to say that moral goodness is democratic. By this, he believed that morality should be based on the happiness and well-being of all people equally, and that the rightness or wrongness of an action should be judged by its consequences in promoting the greatest happiness for the greatest number. This view implies that everyone's happiness counts equally, regardless of their social status, wealth, or power. Bentham argued that each person's pleasure and pain mattered the same as anyone else's, and no one's happiness is inherently more valuable than another's. This approach is democratic because it doesn't prioritize one person or group over another, but seeks to promote the overall well-being of society. By focusing on what benefits the majority, Bentham rejected the moral systems that favored the interests of the elite or privileged, and instead aimed for a fair, inclusive standard of moral goodness that could apply universally. The greatest happiness principle is the central idea of utilitarianism. You've been hearing it since a while ago that utilitarianism revolves around the greatest good for the greatest number. To break it down into even more simpler and more comprehensive words, the best goal in life is to create as much happiness as possible and reduce pain as much as possible for the majority of people. According to this principle, actions are morally good if they result in the most overall happiness or the least unhappiness for the largest number of people. Mill says that the best goal in life is to create as much happiness as possible and reduce pain as much as possible for everyone. Mill is saying that happiness is the ultimate purpose that makes everyone else worthwhile, whether it's something we want for ourselves or others. An example of the greatest happiness principle is during vaccination programs. During vaccination programs, the government may decide to allocate vaccines to more vulnerable populations or areas with the highest transmission rates first, since it's the best action to take to benefit the majority. Moving on to the difference between Mill from Bentham. Mill is against the purely quantitative treatment of the principle of utility because Mill argues that some pleasures are intrinsically superior to others. Take a look at this passage from Mill. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool dissatisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. Now this passage means that it is better to be an intelligent, thoughtful person who is sometimes unhappy than to be a simple-minded creature who is always happy. Because a thoughtful life offers a richer understanding of the world. Mill is saying that even if a pig or a fool might disagree, that's only because they don't understand what a deeper, more complex life feels like. Mill's point is that people who have experienced both shallow pleasures, like the physical or sensual comfort, and deeper pleasures like learning or personal growth or intellectual growth, recognize that the deeper pleasures are actually more valuable, even if they sometimes come with dissatisfaction. Mill also cites Epicurus, who states that although the good life is the life of pleasure, it doesn't mean only bodily and sensual pleasure, since there are higher forms of pleasure like intellectual and spiritual pleasure. Let's take a look at the criterion for judging the quality of pleasure according to Mill. He states that the higher pleasure are intellectual, artistic, and spiritual, such as reading, poetry, speculating about nature or the cosmos, enjoying music and the visual arts, etc. On the other hand, the lower pleasures are more sensual and physical, such as eating good food, intercourse, and other physical stimulation. Moving on to the proof of the principle of utility. Take a look at Mill's passage. In this passage, Mill argues that the only way to prove that something is truly desirable is if people desire it. He uses examples like visibility and audibility to explain this idea. We know something is visible if people can see it, and we know something is audible if people can hear it. Similarly, we know something is desirable if people want it, or if people desire it. Moreover, the principle of utility works because it takes into account the general happiness of society, not just individual or self-interested desires. Therefore, if everyone seeks happiness, society should aim to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. A According to Solomon, the most generous interpretation of Mill's proof is the following. One's happiness is the only thing desired by each person. Therefore, the general happiness of all, is the only thing desired for itself by all. The only test of something's being describable is if it's being desired. Therefore, the general happiness is the only thing desired in itself. Therefore, the only test of the rightness or wrongness of an action is their tendency to promote general happiness, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Moving on to non-hedonistic utilitarianism. The term non-hedonism implies the broadest category of the pluralistic definition of good. Non-hedonism is the belief that not all valuable or good things are about pleasure or happiness. In simple terms, non-hedonists argue that some things like knowledge, beauty, or moral values are worthwhile on their own, even if they don't bring pleasure. A key figure is Hastings Rachel, who explains in his passage that the right action is one that, based on what we know, will bring about the greatest overall good. He suggests that different types of good things can be compared or measured against each other, even if they are different kinds. His pluralistic view is what differentiates him from Bentham and Mills. Epicurus, Bentham, Mill, and Rachel evaluates each action individually based on whether it produces the most happiness. They ask the question, did it promote the greatest good for the greatest number? On the other hand, the rule utilitarian asks the question, what rules, if followed by everyone all of the time, will maximize the good in the world? Rule utilitarians focus on following rules that, if generally adhered to, would lead to the greatest overall happiness. An example of this is when it comes to cheating on a test. That's a scenario. Act utilitarians will justify cheating and try to even advise you to cheat because it will maximize the good. An act utilitarian would look at whether cheating on a test in that specific instance would bring more good than harm. For example, if cheating would lead to a better grade, which could bring opportunities and happiness without any significant negative side effects, an act utilitarian might see it as acceptable. However, they would also consider the risk of getting caught, the potential harm to others' trust, and any other future consequences that might lead to greater unhappiness. On the other hand, rule utilitarians will not calculate the balance of pleasure over pain for the act, but the act of cheating would be checked against the rule of intellectual honesty. They would argue that if everyone cheated, it would lead to a breakdown of trust, unfair advantages, and a devaluation of qualifications. Thus, even if cheating might help one person in the short term, rule utilitarians would see it as harmful in the bigger picture because it undermines the value of education and creates a culture of dishonesty. Therefore, rule utilitarians would generally be against cheating on a test, as following the rule "don't cheat" is likely to bring more long-term happiness and fairness. In short, act utilitarians focus on the immediate consequences of cheating, while rule utilitarians focus on the broader impact of having rules against cheating. And that's all for Unit 5 modules 1 to 3, focusing on utilitarianism.